Don't go in there. The voice sharp, desperate cut through the warm Georgia air just as Charles Whitman reached for the front door of his Buckhead estate. His fingers hovered inches from the polished brass handle when he turned, startled. A small boy was sprinting barefoot across the stone driveway. He couldn't have been older than 7. His shirt was torn, his pants streaked with mud and engine grease. A yellow wool hat, sun-bleached and frayed, clung to his head as he ran, waving both arms in the air like warning flags. Charles stepped back. What the hell? The boy stopped at the foot of the porch, panting hard. His dark brown eyes were wide, frightened, locked on Charles with the intensity of someone who had nothing to lose. Please, mister, he gasped, trying to catch his breath. Don't open the door. There's something in your house. Something bad. Charles stiffened. His first instinct was skepticism. His second was to summon security. But something in the boy's voice, the trembling urgency, the way he seemed genuinely terrified held him. You're trespassing, Charles said, his voice cold and measured. Who are you? The boy clutched the hem of his shirt, swallowed hard. Isaiah. I sleep. Near your trash bins. Behind the hydrangeas. He motioned toward the edge of the estate where the privacy fence dipped behind a row of shrubbery. Charles's brow furrowed. What are you talking about? What's in my house? Isaiah looked over his shoulder, as if making sure no one else had followed him. Then he whispered, 2 men. Last night. They broke in. I saw them from where I was hiding. One of them had tools. They messed with something under the counter in your kitchen. They were talking about the air. Charles's stomach tightened. What do you mean, the air? Isaiah's voice dropped lower. He said, let's see if a rich man can breathe money. Then they left. I waited all night for you to come back. Charles didn't move. He suddenly felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Not fear yet, but a deep, gnawing unease. He took out his phone and called 911. State your emergency? The dispatcher asked. There's been a possible break-in. I need fire and police at my home. There may be a gas leak. Within minutes, the estate was crawling with responders. The fire chief, a stocky man with gray hair and a no-nonsense voice, walked out of the house with his helmet under his arm. You were lucky, Mr. Whitman, he said. There was a slow leak from one of your gas lines. Someone had tampered with the valve behind the main stove. It wasn't visible from the outside. Charles's jaw tightened. Was it enough to cause an explosion? The chief shook his head. No explosion. But had you walked inside and stayed for more than a few minutes, the concentration in the air would have been lethal. Most folks pass out before they realize what's happening. If you'd locked the door behind you. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Charles turned and looked at the small boy sitting silently on the edge of the marble steps, his yellow hat balled up in his hands, his shoulders trembling. The memory hit him like a punch. A similar boy, gaunt and scared, slumped against a brick wall in an alley downtown. That had been his younger brother, Brandon, 12 years ago. Charles hadn't reached out. Brandon had died alone 2 weeks later. He stepped over and crouched beside Isaiah. The boy tensed but didn't move. Why'd you warn me? Charles asked softly. You could have just walked away. Isaiah shrugged, still not meeting his eyes. I saw your picture once, in a paper. Said you gave money to my old orphanage, the one in Midtown. I remembered your face. Charles blinked. You were at Hope House? Isaiah nodded. Before they shut it down. Before Mama left. I kept the picture. Still have it. He pulled a crumpled newspaper clipping from his pocket and handed it to Charles with both hands. There he was, Charles Whitman, 3 years younger, standing stiffly in front of a check the size of a door, smiling beside a director whose name he no longer recalled. The headline read, Tech Mogul Donates to Youth Shelter, Amid Public Backlash. It had been a PR stunt, a temporary fix to a bruised reputation. Charles looked down at Isaiah again. Are you hungry? The boy gave the faintest nod. Come inside, Charles said. Let's get you something to eat. Isaiah's voice shook. There's no more gas, right? No, Charles replied. They turned it off. Isaiah hesitated, then stood. His yellow hat drooped in his hand as he followed Charles through the door. What they didn't see, what no one could, was the invisible line they'd just crossed. From 2 strangers divided by everything, to 2 souls breathing the same air of second chances. And in that moment, Charles no longer saw a homeless boy in front of him but a human being. Brave, quiet, and the one who had just saved his life. Give this boy a like for his courage and quick thinking. Before we continue the story, tell me where are you watching this video from? You might be surprised there could be plenty of people near you watching this exact same video right now. Isaiah sat at the edge of the mahogany kitchen stool, legs dangling, unsure if he was allowed to touch anything. His small hands clutched the yellow wool hat tightly in his lap. The granite countertop sparkled under the soft pendant lighting, and everything smelled faintly of citrus polish and roasted garlic. Charles placed a steaming plate of leftover pasta in front of the boy. "It's just spaghetti," he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. "No mushrooms. Hope that's okay." Isaiah gave a small nod. "Looks fancy." Charles watched him for a moment, then turned to the fridge. He pulled out a bottle of spring water and set it next to the plate. The boy hesitated only a second longer before digging in, eating slowly at first, then with urgency. He was starving. Charles leaned against the opposite counter, arms folded, silence filling the space between them. The events of the last hour hadn't fully landed yet. A gas leak deliberate. Someone had tried to kill him, and this child, someone he'd never met before, had saved his life. "But why? You really used to live at Hope House?" Charles asked gently. Isaiah paused, sauce on his chin. "Yeah, when I was little, Mama dropped me off there when she couldn't pay rent. Said she'd come back once she got work." Charles waited. Isaiah didn't continue. "Did she?" he asked softly. Isaiah shook his head and went back to eating. "They tried to put me in foster care. I ran." Charles felt something twist in his chest. "How long have you been on your own?" "I don't know," the boy murmured. "Couple months maybe. I sleep in places nobody looks." The boy's voice was matter-of-fact, like he was talking about the weather. Charles thought of his own childhood-gated communities, private schools, a driver who picked him up in a town car. He'd never once gone hungry, never had to fear falling asleep in the wrong alley. And yet, he had failed his brother. Brandon had spiraled out of control before anyone in the family could or would intervene. Drugs, homelessness, mental illness. Charles had thrown money at the problem, written checks, paid for rehab, but never once sat down and listened. He hadn't even gone to the hospital the last time, only to the funeral. Isaiah's story scraped something raw inside him. "Why did you keep that newspaper?" Charles asked. "That photo of me?" Isaiah shrugged. "You looked nice in it, like maybe you actually cared." He said it without sarcasm. Charles turned away for a moment, pretending to rinse a clean plate. "That donation, it wasn't what it looked like. I only did it to fix bad press. I hadn't even visited the place before that photo was taken." Isaiah chewed slower. "I still thought maybe you were different." Charles looked over his shoulder. "After everything you've been through, how could you still think that?" The boy didn't answer. He just shrugged again, as if hope was a habit he hadn't been able to shake. After a pause, Charles asked, "Where did you sleep last night?" "In the little gap behind the bins," Isaiah said. "It's warm there, smells, but better than some places." Charles exhaled. "You said you saw 2 men last night. Did you recognize them?" "Number. They wore hoodies. One of them had a flashlight. The other kept watch." "Did they say anything else?" Isaiah looked up. "One of them said, 'He's gonna sleep deep tonight.' That's when I knew it was bad." Charles nodded slowly. "You stayed until I came home. That's a long wait. I didn't want you to die." Those 5 words slammed into him harder than he expected. A boy who had no one, no food, no home, had waited all night not to steal, not to beg but to warn a stranger. Charles cleared his throat. "You're not going back out there tonight." Isaiah froze. "You mean I can stay?" "For tonight, yes," Charles said. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." The boy looked down, visibly trying to hide a small, private smile. After dinner, Charles showed him the guest, room small but warm, with a clean bed and a nightlight. Isaiah hesitated at the door, looking around like he'd entered a dream. "There's fresh towels in the bathroom," Charles said. "Shower's all yours. I'll leave a shirt outside the door." Isaiah blinked at him. "You're really nice for a rich guy." Charles tried to smile. "Don't let it get around. I've got a reputation." The boy Lafetta sounded so honest and brief it almost startled Charles. Later that night, Charles sat alone in his study. The news was on mute. He stared at the grainy image of himself on the screen security footage from the estate. Capturing the moment, Isaiah stopped him. The news ticker read, CEO targeted in gas tampering incident, police investigating possible sabotage. He muted the television again and looked down at the newspaper clipping Isaiah had left on the desk. His own face, 3 years younger, smiling with hollow pride. What had Victor said the last time he came to Whitman Development? Something like, "You took my house, my job. What do I tell my son when he asks why we sleep in a car?" Charles had shrugged him off. Had security escort him out. What if it had been Victor? The thought came like a gust of cold air. He opened his laptop and began typing. Victor Freeman. South Atlanta eviction. Complaint history. Employment records. Something told him this wasn't random. Upstairs, the hallway light dimmed as Isaiah curled under a warm blanket for the first time in months. He placed the yellow hat on the nightstand, next to a glass of water, and whispered to himself, "Please don't kick me out tomorrow." He didn't know that Charles was already downstairs, writing out a planet just to protect the boy, but to finally face the ghosts he'd ignored for far too long. And maybe, for the first time, he was ready to listen. Charles woke earlier than usual. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that wrapped around you like fog. For a moment, he sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, staring down at the hardwood floor as morning light crept across it. Something felt different today. Not just the near death from gas poisoning. Not even the boy sleeping upstairs. It was something heavier, something awakening. By the time he'd showered and thrown on a navy flannel shirt and jeans, the smell of toast was already drifting from the kitchen. That stopped him cold. He never used the toaster. No one did. His housekeeper didn't arrive until noon. He walked downstairs cautiously. Isaiah stood by the kitchen counter, awkwardly buttering toast with a plastic knife. His shirt, 2 sizes too big, hung off his frame like drapes. He'd folded up the sleeves, but one side still flopped over his hand. Charles recognized the shirt. It had belonged to Brandon. Isaiah turned. "Morning." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect you to be up this early." "I was hungry," Isaiah said simply. "And you said I could stay, so I figured I could make toast and not get in trouble." "You figured right." "I'm in." The boy relaxed a little and placed an extra slice on a small plate. "Want some?" Charles hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." They sat together at the island counter, eating in silence. For a moment, it felt like something out of a memory Charles never had. A quiet morning, a simple meal, the absence of performance. After breakfast, Charles leaned back in his stool. "I want to ask you something serious, Isaiah." The boy stopped chewing. "Those 2 men, if I show you some photos, do you think you could recognize them?" Isaiah looked unsure. "Maybe. I didn't see much. One of them had a scar near his eye, and he walked with a little limp." Charles's heart skipped. That was more detail than he expected. "I might have a name," he said. "Victor Freeman. Does that mean anything to you?" Isaiah frowned, thinking. Number, but one of them said something like, "He owes me his life." Charles leaned forward, the words cutting sharper than intended. "Are you sure?" Isaiah nodded slowly. They said it while laughing. One of them had a deep voice, like a smoker. Charles pushed away from the counter. He went into his office and returned with his laptop. "I need you to look at something." He opened a file and scrolled to an archived report from over a year ago. On the screen, a protest photo outside Whitman Development, grainy, but clear enough. Signs, angry faces, and in the center a man with a sunburned neck and a scar just below his right eye. Isaiah pointed. "That's him." Charles stared. Victor Freeman. He'd come to their office once, yelling, desperate. Charles hadn't even met him in person. His assistant had called security. The incident had been buried with legal paperwork and silence. But the man hadn't forgotten. Charles closed the laptop. Isaiah watched him. "You okay?" "No," Charles admitted. "I was supposed to help people. I thought building condos meant progress, but maybe all I built were tombstones with marble countertops." Isaiah didn't quite understand the metaphor, but he could feel the weight in Charles's voice. Later that morning, Charles made a call to a retired investigator he'd used once during a corporate merger. "I need to know everything about a man named Victor Freeman," he said. "Background, last known address, anything he's filed against Whitman Development in the past 5 years. Give me a few hours," the man said. Charles hung up and turned to Isaiah. "Let's go for a drive." They rode through downtown Atlanta in Charles's black Lexus. Isaiah pressed his nose to the window, watching the buildings blur by. "I've never been in a car this quiet," he said. "Can't even hear the engine." "That's the point," Charles said, but he smiled. He drove them to a small community center in South Atlanta. It sat across the street from a fenced-off lot where a line of old row houses had once stood, now flattened, replaced by gravel and a sign that read, "Future Home of the Whitman Residences." Isaiah looked out at the empty land. "People used to live here?" "Yes," Charles replied. "A lot of families, including Victor Freeman." "What happened to them?" "I happened." Isaiah looked up, confused. Charles took a breath. "We bought the land. We told the city we'd bring in jobs, high-end retail, tax revenue. But the people here couldn't afford to wait for promises. They just got pushed out." Isaiah stared at the lot, quiet. "You didn't know what would happen?" "I knew," Charles said. "I just didn't think it was my responsibility." Back at the house, Isaiah curled up on the couch with a book from the shelf. Charles returned to his study. The report had arrived. Victor Freeman, former electrician. Single father, evicted 16 months ago. Filed, 2 appeals, both denied. Last known address, car registered in his name, impounded 3 weeks ago. No known relatives. No current employment. And a sealed complaint to Whitman Development from over a year ago. Subject line: wrongful displacement. Request for restitution. It had never reached Charles, marked as non-urgent, then archived. He stared at it, jaw clenched. The intercom crackled. Isaiah's voice came through timidly. "Mr. Whitman?" "Yes? I think I left my hat in the guest room. Is it okay if I go get it?" Charles smiled faintly. "Of course." As the line clicked off, Charles sat back, rubbing his temples. He had nearly died because someone wanted revenge, but he had lived because a child remembered a photo one taken for show. Maybe it was time he did something real. For Isaiah. For Brandon. For all the people he hadn't seen until now. By the time evening rolled in, Charles Whitman sat in his study surrounded by files he had never read before, boxes labeled Community Response, Eviction Claims, Displacement Hearings. They had collected dust in a basement storage unit, tucked away under the pretense of handled. But they weren't. They were ignored, buried, sanitized for the quarterly reports. He flipped open another folder. Freeman. Victor. Inside was a printed copy of the sealed letter Victor had sent. It wasn't angry, it was pleading. 2 pages written in tidy handwriting, scanned from a public library. Charles read every word. "My son is 9. He still asks why we had to sleep in the car. I tell him it's temporary. I tell him men like you don't mean harm. Please don't make me a liar." Charles rubbed the bridge of his nose. He remembered the headline they'd spun when the last row houses were cleared. "Revitalization project will bring jobs to the South Side." He had believed it then, or told himself he did. Downstairs, Isaiah's voice broke through the fog of memory. The boy was humming, softly, off-key. Charles stood and walked out of the study. He found Isaiah curled up in a corner of the sunroom, flipping through a book of maps. "You like geography?" Charles asked. Isaiah shrugged. "I like places. Places where things are better than here." Charles sat in the armchair across from him. "What do you mean by better?" "I don't know. Places where moms don't disappear, where people don't pretend they don't see you when you sleep on a bench." Charles was quiet for a beat. "You shouldn't have had to know that kind of world." Isaiah glanced up. "But I do." A long silence passed between them. Charles finally spoke. "I owe a lot of people an apology, Isaiah. And maybe more than that." Isaiah closed the book. "You trying to fix it?" "I think I need to." He hesitated, then reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a worn photo. Brandon. His brother, younger, wild smile, eyes full of defiance and pain. "This is my brother," Charles said. "He was on the street too. I didn't help him in time." Isaiah looked at the picture, then at Charles. "Is that why you didn't walk away from me?" Charles nodded. "That's exactly why." The next morning, Charles called his attorney. "I want to find Victor Freeman, not to press charges, to understand." "Charles, that's highly irregular." "Do it anyway." He then contacted Miss Kelly, a social worker he vaguely remembered from the Hope House fundraiser. "I need records," he said. "Children placed in the system. transfers, especially one named Isaiah. She was surprised but agreed to meet. That afternoon, Charles and Isaiah drove to Midtown. Kelly greeted them in her modest office lined with children's drawings and faded motivational posters. "Isaiah," she said softly, bending down. "You've grown." The boy looked surprised. "You remember me?" She smiled gently. "We all remember the quiet ones." Charles sat opposite her as she retrieved a thick manila folder. Isaiah was placed with 3 different foster homes after his mother left, she explained. He ran from the last one. That was nearly 9 months ago. Charles looked at Isaiah. "Why'd you run?" "They didn't talk to me. Just fed me. Made me sleep in a room with peeling paint and a lock on the outside." Kelly nodded solemnly. "Unfortunately, not uncommon." Charles took a breath. "I'd like to petition for temporary guardianship." Kelly blinked. "That's a big step." "I don't care. He saved my life. I won't let him disappear again." She looked between the two of them. "We'll need a home study. Background check. You know the drill. Start it today," Charles said. On the ride home, Isaiah was unusually quiet. Charles glanced at him. "You okay? You want me to stay?" "Yes, for as long as you want." Isaiah looked out the window. "Even if I don't belong in houses like yours?" Charles kept his eyes on the road. "You belong where someone sees you." That night, while Isaiah slept, Charles received a call from his investigator. "We found Victor. He's in Decatur, staying with a former coworker. Seems unstable. Lost custody of his son a year ago." Charles didn't hesitate. "Send me the address." The next morning, he went alone. The house was modest, worn down, front porch sagging from age. A man sat on the steps, smoking, scar on his cheek, eyes tired, hardened by years of disappointment. Victor Freeman. Charles stepped forward. "Mr. Freeman." Victor stood slowly. "You're a long way from your mansion, Whitman. I came to talk. You came to ease your conscience." "Maybe," Charles said. "But mostly I came to say you were right." Victor squinted at him. "You think words fix eviction? Think that brings back the nights in the car? Number. But I'm not here for a headline." Victor took a long drag. "You stole my home, my dignity. My son doesn't even trust me anymore. He says I look like a ghost." Charles stepped closer. "I never read your letter. Not until yesterday. If I had." "You didn't." Victor's voice rose. "You had time. You had people. But you didn't care. So why care now?" Charles didn't flinch. "Because someone like my brother died on the street. Because a little boy named Isaiah waited 12 hours just to keep me alive. Because I can't live with what I ignored anymore." Victor stared at him, jaw clenched. Then, slowly, he sat back down. "You got 10 minutes." And in that fragile space of silence, 2 men who had everything and one who had lost it all began to talk, not as CEO and victim, but as fathers, as men who had both failed, and maybe, just maybe, wanted to find a way back from that failure, together. Victor didn't say much during those first few minutes. He just stared at the cracked concrete under his feet, flicking ash from his cigarette into the weeds growing through the steps. Charles sat beside him, hands folded, trying not to let the weight of guilt collapse the fragile moment between them. "I begged your people," Victor finally said, voice rough from smoke and years of bitterness. "I begged them for a meeting. For mercy. For anything. My kid was coughing blood from mold in that house, and they told me I'd be relocated. You know what that meant? A deadline and a lock change." Charles said nothing. There was no defense. He didn't even try. Victor continued. "I took extra shifts. I even offered to help with the wiring for your new condos free. Said it might buy me a week." They laughed. "Security dragged me out before I finished my sentence." "I remember the report," Charles said quietly. "But I never read the letter. Not until yesterday." Victor looked at him then, disbelief tightening his jaw. "You didn't read it because you didn't have to. That's the kind of power you have. You could ruin lives without even noticing." Charles nodded. "I know. You know now. I want to make it right." Victor laughed bitterly. "You think cutting a check fixes this?" "No," Charles said. "I think nothing fixes it, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't try." Victor's eyes narrowed. "Why now?" Charles hesitated, then said, "Because I almost died. And the only reason I didn't, was a boy sleeping behind my trash cans. A boy who kept a newspaper photo of me because he thought I looked kind in it. I can't explain why that changes everything. It just does. Victor looked away, silent again. Charles reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. I'm opening a fund. Not just money housing, job training, legal support. I want your input. I want your voice in this. Real input. Not performative. No cameras. Victor took the paper but didn't unfold it. He stared at it like it might bite him. My son, he said, his voice lower now. He's in foster care. Won't talk to me. Thinks I'm a failure. Charles's eyes softened. Then maybe we start there. Victor's fingers clenched the paper. You gonna help me get him back? If that's what you want, yes. Victor studied him again. Then, slowly, he nodded. You get one shot. That's all I need. As Charles walked back to his car, something shifted in the air around him. It wasn't absolution. It was weight, the beginning of penance. That evening, back at the house, Isaiah was in the backyard, barefoot on the grass, tracing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Charles watched him from the patio, sipping coffee. How was your meeting? Isaiah asked without looking up. Hard, Charles replied, but important. Isaiah nodded. He mad at you? He should be. But he listened? He did. Isaiah stabbed the stick into the ground and walked over. You gonna help him now? Charles nodded. Him, his son, others like them. Isaiah sat on the patio step. Good. That's what heroes do. Charles smiled faintly. I don't think I'm a hero, Isaiah. The boy leaned against him. You're trying. That counts. The next morning, Charles met with Miss Kelly again. This time, he brought Isaiah and handed over completed forms for emergency guardianship. We fast-tracked the background check, Kelly said. I've never seen someone move this quickly, especially someone in your position. Charles shrugged. Positions change. Isaiah clutched the yellow hat in his lap like a security blanket. When the papers were signed, Kelly handed Charles a temporary certificate. The boy looked up at him, wide-eyed. What does that mean? He asked. Charles crouched down. It means you're not just a guest anymore. Isaiah blinked hard, then threw his arms around Charles's neck. They left the office in silence, the air between them fuller than words. That afternoon, Charles called a press conference not at the city hall or the company's glass tower downtown, but on the vacant lot in South Atlanta where the old homes used to stand. He wore no suit, no tie, just jeans, rolled sleeves, and a voice that shook only once. We built these condos to raise the skyline, he began, but we lowered the dignity of the people who lived here before. That's on me. Cameras clicked, reporters scribbled, and across the street, Victor stood with his arms crossed, watching. Charles continued. Starting today, Whitman Development is launching the Second Wind Initiative, an effort to restore not just homes, but trust. Affordable housing, support services, legal advocacy, all guided by the people who were most affected. He paused, then motioned to Isaiah, standing a few steps behind. This is Isaiah. He saved my life. He reminded me that the most invisible people often carry the most powerful truths, and I refused to look away again. When the conference ended, people clapped some politely, others genuinely, but Charles didn't care about applause. He only cared that Victor gave him a small nod before walking away. That night, Charles tucked Isaiah into bed. The boy held onto his hat like always. Can I stay here forever? He asked. Charles brushed a hand over Isaiah's hair. As long as you want. This is your home now. Isaiah smiled, already half asleep. Then I'll stop running. Charles sat beside the bed for a long time after that, watching the boy breathe, listening to the stillness of a house that had once felt so empty, now filled with something he hadn't known he needed: purpose. Tomorrow, there would be lawyers, contractors, endless meetings. But tonight, there was only this moment, quiet, complete, and for the first time in years, Charles Whitman didn't feel like a man running from ghosts. He felt like someone who had started to earn forgiveness on breath, one step, one promise at a time. 3 days later, the early morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of Charles Whitman's estate, casting golden lines across the marble floor. The house had never been so full of motion contractors coming in for inspection reports, new staff orientation packets on the kitchen table, and emails flooding Charles's inbox from non-profit partners eager to collaborate on the Second Wind initiative. Isaiah sat at the island counter with a glass of orange juice and a half-eaten banana, watching Charles pace the living room in jeans and a black sweater, phone to his ear. Yes, I want those units rent, controlled, permanently. No exceptions, Charles said sharply. He paused to listen. No, I don't care about profit margins. We're not in the business of bleeding the people we displaced. He hung up with a deep sigh, then glanced at Isaiah. Didn't sleep, did you? The boy asked, chewing slowly. Not much, Charles admitted. You talk in your sleep. I do? Yeah, Isaiah smirked. You said ceiling fans in every unit or I'm walking. Charles chuckled despite himself. That's oddly accurate. A knock at the door drew his attention. He opened it to find Victor Freeman, wearing a clean but faded jacket, holding a folder under one arm. His expression was cautious but not hostile. You said you wanted my input, Victor said. You meant it? Charles stepped aside. Come in. Isaiah perked up the moment he saw Victor. Hey, you're the guy with the scar. Victor blinked, then gave a tight smile. Yeah, that'd be me. Charles gestured toward the dining table. We'll talk in here. Isaiah lingered for a moment. You want me to go? No, Charles said. You stay. Victor looked at the boy, then at Charles, eyebrows raised. He deserves to see what rebuilding looks like, Charles said. Victor opened the folder. Inside were sketches, notes, handwritten ideas for how to rebuild the neighborhood without repeating the past. We need a daycare center on site, Victor said, tapping a page. A lot of single parents work 2 jobs. And don't forget corner markets that take snap note of that Whole Foods crap. Charles nodded, making notes. And no gates, Victor added firmly. We don't need walls around these new homes. We need porches, places where neighbors talk again. I like porches, Isaiah mumbled through a bite of toast. Victor glanced at him. Me too, kid. They worked through the folder, line by line, hour by hour, and when they finished, Charles stood and extended his hand. Let's build it your way. Victor looked at him for a long moment before finally shaking his hand. As Victor left, Isaiah followed him to the door. Are you going to see your son soon? He asked. Victor paused, the question hanging in the air like dust in sunlight. I hope so. Maybe not today, but I'm working on it. Good, Isaiah said. He probably misses you. Victor swallowed hard. Yeah, I miss him too. The door closed gently behind him. That afternoon, Charles brought Isaiah to Hope House, the orphanage that had once been a footnote in his charitable giving. But now, it was different. The building had been purchased outright under the Second Wind Foundation. Repairs were underway. New staff were being interviewed. Child psychologists and trauma counselors walked the halls in sneakers, not heels. This place looks better, Isaiah whispered, holding Charles's hand. It will be, Charles said. We're naming the new wing after you. Isaiah stopped. Me? Yeah, the Isaiah Hall. For kids who never got a real chance but gave one anyway. The boy blushed, looking down at his sneakers. Can it have bean bags? It'll have whatever you want. That night, back at home, Charles was reading Isaiah a story when the boy interrupted. Why didn't you help your brother? The question landed like a punch soft, unexpected, but deep. Charles closed the book slowly. I was selfish. I thought sending money was enough. I thought if I didn't see the pain, it couldn't touch me. Isaiah nodded solemnly. I think sometimes people forget pain doesn't need an invitation. Charles blinked, his throat tightening. You're right, he whispered. Isaiah leaned back on the pillows. But maybe you helping me is kind of like helping him too. Charles looked at the boy, eyes suddenly burning. He reached out and placed a hand over Isaiah's. Maybe it is. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. The house, once sterile and cold now, carried the quiet warmth of something human, something healing. The next morning, Charles was on the phone with a city councilman when Isaiah walked in holding a small cardboard box. What's that? Charles asked, covering the phone. Isaiah opened the flaps. Inside were 2 photographs, a plastic dinosaur missing an arm, a packet of crackers, and the folded newspaper article with Charles's picture. My treasure box, Isaiah said proudly. Charles hung up the phone. That's everything you have? It was. Charles looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Let's add to it. He opened his desk drawer, pulled out a keychain with the Whitman crest on it, and handed it over. Isaiah turned it in his hands. This is real silver? Solid, Charles said. What's it for? For the front door. For any door. It means you belong. Isaiah smiled. A little crooked, a little cautious, but it reached his eyes. And with that, the boy who used to sleep behind trash bins became, without fanfare or ceremony, part of something permanent. Not a guest, not a statistic. Family. As the sun climbed higher, the two sat side by side, one man learning to listen, one boy learning to trust, quietly building a future neither had expected, but both had always needed. It was Sunday morning when Charles Whitman found himself standing in front of a church he hadn't stepped inside since his mother's funeral nearly 2 decades earlier. The building stood modestly on Auburn Avenue, its red brick faded by time, its wooden pews visible through stained glass windows that flickered in the sun. Isaiah stood beside him, squinting up at the bell tower. This where you used to go? The boy asked. Only when I was a kid, Charles replied, back when I still believed that silence meant peace, not avoidance. Isaiah tilted his head. What's that mean? It means I used to sit here and pray for people I didn't want to talk to. Charles smiled, then nodded toward the door. Come on, there's someone inside I want you to meet. Inside the church, the Reverend Grace Taylor stood near the altar, flipping through the day's hymnal list. Her silver curls caught the morning light, and her eyes, though kind, held no illusions. She'd known Charles since he was a boy, known Brandon too, and she'd been the last person to visit him before the overdose. Well, if it isn't the Whitman who finally shows his face without a check in his hand, she said, arms folded. Charles gave a sheepish grin. I figured I owed more than money this time. Grace raised an eyebrow, then looked at Isaiah. And this little man? This is Isaiah. He's the reason I'm still breathing. Isaiah gave a small wave. Hi, ma'am. Polite too. Grace stepped forward and crouched a little, looking Isaiah in the eyes. You've got good instincts. Don't let the world steal them. Isaiah nodded, not quite sure what to say. Grace stood and looked back at Charles. You didn't come just to reminisce, did you? Charles shook his head. I need help. I'm rebuilding Hope House. I need someone who knows what healing actually looks like. Grace's expression softened. You finally listening, Charles? He nodded. I'm trying to. She walked to the altar, touched it gently. I'll come, but only if you promise not to turn this into another press moment. These kids don't need heroes. They need people who show up when no one's watching. Deal, Charles said without hesitation. As they left the church, Isaiah tugged on Charles's sleeve. She's kind of scary. She's exactly the kind of scary we need, Charles said with a grin. Back at the estate, the phone rang just as they stepped inside. Charles answered, his expression shifting immediately. Yes, that's correct. Wait, what? Where? He hung up and turned to Isaiah. That was Kelly, the social worker. Victor's son, Jacob, was located. He's in a group home in Macon. They think he's ready to see his dad. Isaiah's eyes widened. You gonna tell him? Charles nodded. Right now. They drove to Victor's temporary residence, a 2-room rental tucked behind a tire shop. Victor opened the door shirtless, holding a coffee mug and blinking in surprise. Jacob? He said, before Charles even spoke. We found him, Charles confirmed. You can see him, but you'll need to go through a supervised visit first. Victor exhaled, setting down the mug. He hates me. He's scared. But scared doesn't mean gone. Victor looked away for a long moment. What if I fail him again? You already didn't, Isaiah said from behind Charles. You didn't disappear. That counts. Victor smiled faintly. Smart kid. Charles clapped a hand on Victor's shoulder. You've got a second chance. Don't waste it. The next few days moved like the turning of a slow tide. Hope House's renovations picked up speed. Volunteers arrived, daily retired teachers, counselors, even a few ex-residents who heard about the rebuild through whispers, flyers, and community forums. Isaiah was there every day, helping stock bookshelves, painting walls, organizing toy bins. He never said much, but he listened, watched, learned. One afternoon, Charles found him sitting alone in the corner of the new Isaiah Hall, looking up at the freshly mounted plaque bearing his name. You don't have to pretend to be okay all the time. Charles said, sitting beside him. Isaiah swallowed hard. I know. It just feels like, if I stop smiling, someone might send me back. Charles shook his head. You're not going back. This is forward now. All of it. Isaiah leaned into him, quiet. That evening, Charles stood in his office, overlooking the city through his window. The skyline he once measured in dollars now looked differentless, like glass trophies, more like shadows of what had been lost and what might still be found. His assistant buzzed in. There's a reporter downstairs from the Journal. Wants to do a story on the boy who saved the CEO. Charles pressed the button. Tell her no. But let her know if she wants to write about Hope House and the kids there. We'll make time. He walked down the hallway and peeked into Isaiah's room. The boy was asleep, clutching a worn-out teddy bear that Charles didn't even recognize. Probably donated. Probably more valuable to him than any silver spoon. Charles turned off the light and stepped back into the hallway, where a framed photo of Brandon hung smiling, whole, long before the streets took him. For what it's worth, Charles whispered, I think I'm finally listening. And in that quiet house, no longer hollow, no longer echoing with absence, Charles Whitman finally understood what it meant to be present, not just with money, not just with apologies, but with presence, choices, and the kind of daily commitment that doesn't make headlines, just like Isaiah had done for him. One breath, one word, one warning, and now, one future. Together. It was 2 weeks after the reopening of Hope House when Victor finally saw his son again. The meeting took place in a quiet, sunlit room at the Macon Group home. There were no cameras, no press, just a folding table, 2 chairs, and a box of tissues that neither man reached for, but both noticed. Charles had arranged the visit, and though he stayed in the hallway, his presence was felt. Isaiah sat beside him, legs swinging from the bench outside the door. You think Jacob will talk to him? Charles looked down. I don't know, but I think showing up matters more than saying the perfect thing. Inside, Victor stood by the window, while Jacob entered, a gangly teenager with wary eyes and hands shoved into his hoodie pocket. He didn't speak, just looked. And Victor, he didn't push. After nearly a minute, Victor said, You look taller. Jacob shrugged. I eat better now. Victor nodded slowly. That's good. Silence again. Then Jacob asked, Why didn't you come for me sooner? Victor's voice cracked. Because I thought I'd already lost you. Jacob didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. That was enough for now. Later that evening, Charles and Isaiah stopped by a modest diner just off I-75. It was a small place with checkered floors and booths that squeaked when you sat. Isaiah devoured a plate of pancakes like he hadn't eaten in days. You know you can ask for something else, right? Charles chuckled. You don't have to eat breakfast for dinner just because it's cheap. Isaiah grinned through a mouthful. This isn't cheap. It's perfect. Charles sipped his coffee and glanced out the window, eyes lingering on the passing cars. We'll be opening 3 more community centers in the next year, he said quietly. South Fulton, East Point, and one near the airport. Isaiah nodded. Are you scared? A little, Charles admitted. Not of doing it wrong. You won't, Isaiah said confidently. You have people now. That sentence stayed with Charles longer than the meal. Back at home, Charles received an email from the mayor's office. They wanted to recognize his work with the community in an upcoming civic awards ceremony. He stared at the screen, fingers poised over the keyboard, then closed the laptop without replying. Instead, he walked down the hallway to Isaiah's room. The boy was sitting cross-legged on the bed, flipping through a photo album. Charles had given him a collection of pictures from his first days at Hope House to now. Who's this? Isaiah asked, pointing to a picture of a younger Charles, arms around a boy that clearly wasn't Isaiah. That's my brother, Brandon, Charles said, sitting beside him. That was the last photo we took together before he left. Isaiah looked up. You think he'd be proud of you now? Charles thought about it. I think he'd ask what took me so long. Isaiah grinned, then leaned into him. Well, I'm glad you got here anyway. The next morning, Charles took Isaiah to a small park near the heart of the city, just a patch of green surrounded by brick buildings, with a broken fountain and a single playground. Children were running around barefoot, mothers on benches, grandparents pushing strollers. A woman sat near the edge of the field with a guitar, singing softly to herself. Her voice trembled but held a kind of peace that stopped Charles in his tracks. Isaiah tugged his sleeve. "That's her." Charles looked down. "Who?" "That's my mom." The words hit like a slow-moving train. He turned sharply, scanning the woman's face. She was thinner than he remembered from the shelter's intake photo. Older, fragile in a way only life could shape. "Are you sure?" he whispered. Isaiah nodded. "I remember her hands. She used to sing when she braided my hair." Charles's breath caught. "Do you want to go to her?" Isaiah hesitated, heart pounding. "Not yet. Can we just sit?" So they sat. On a bench, silent, watching her sing to no one and everyone. Charles didn't push. He just stayed. It was nearly an hour before Isaiah stood, walking slowly across the field. Charles stayed behind, watching as the boy approached the woman. She looked up, startled, guitar slipping from her lap. Then she reached out, hand trembling. Isaiah fell into her arms. No words could be heard from where Charles sat, but he saw everything in the way her shoulders shook, in the way Isaiah buried his face against her neck like he was 4 years old again. When Isaiah returned, tears fresh but eyes bright, Charles didn't ask anything. "She's been clean 6 months," Isaiah whispered. "She didn't come back because she thought she'd ruin me." Charles nodded. "Do you want to see her again?" Isaiah clutched his yellow hat in both hands. "Yeah, but I still want to stay home with you." Charles smiled. "You're allowed to have both." That night, back in the quiet of the estate, Isaiah placed a new photo in his treasure box, a picture of him and his mother in front of the fountain. He added a small pebble he picked up from the park. "I think this means things don't stay broken forever," he said. Charles tucked him in, his hand resting briefly on the boy's shoulder. "No," he whispered, "not if someone's willing to fix them." And in the silence that followed, beneath the roof of a house once built on distance, 2 lives continued to stitch themselves back together slowly, deliberately, lovingly, until nothing felt broken anymore. The ceremony wasn't supposed to be grand. Charles had insisted on that. No red carpets, no velvet ropes, no suits and ties. Just folding chairs arranged under a white canopy in front of the newly rebuilt Hope House, the late spring breeze rustling the banners hung above the entrance. The banner read, in bold navy lettering, "The Isaiah Hall, a place to begin again." Isaiah sat in the front row, swinging his legs nervously, wearing his favorite gray hoodie and a clean pair of jeans Charles had bought him the week before. The yellow knit hat faded now, and fraying sat proudly on his head, even in the warm afternoon sun. Charles stood beside the podium, fingers loosely holding a folded speech he wasn't sure he'd use. In the crowd were faces both familiar and new. Victor Freeman, standing tall in a navy jacket, with his son Jacob beside him, awkward and quiet but present. Grace Taylor from the church, Miss Kelly, former residents, volunteers, parents, kids, neighbors. This wasn't a celebration of Charles Whitman. He made that clear. This was a ceremony for everyone who never had one, a ceremony for return, for repair. When the mayor stepped up to speak, Charles politely declined to follow her. Instead, he walked straight to the center of the crowd and lifted a small microphone clipped to his collar. "6 months ago," he began, "I didn't know Isaiah. I didn't know Victor. I didn't know half the people standing here today. I thought I knew what leadership looked like, meetings, metrics, margins, but I didn't know what community meant." He turned to Isaiah and smiled. "A little boy reminded me." Isaiah blinked fast, eyes already glassy. Charles continued, voice low, steady. "I'm not proud of how long it took, or how many people I hurt along the way, but I am proud that we're here, and I'm proud that the place behind me, this building, this name isn't a monument to guilt, it's a promise." He looked out over the crowd, a promise that the invisible will be seen, that second chances don't expire, that justice doesn't always come from a courtroom, it can begin with a whisper, a warning. Even a child who shouldn't have had to carry that kind of weight. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. Charles took a breath and finished. "If I've learned anything, it's this: people don't need saving, they need to be believed. And when they are, they can save each other." He stepped away from the mic. No applause at first, just silence, deep and resonant. Then, slowly, hands came together, then more, louder. But Charles didn't linger in it. He walked back to Isaiah, knelt beside him, and handed him a small, square envelope. "What's this?" Isaiah asked. "Something you've earned." The boy opened it. Inside was a certificate, embossed with gold lettering. "Permanent custody, granted Isaiah Whitman." His mouth fell open. "You adopted me?" Charles nodded, tears brimming. "As of this morning." Isaiah flung his arms around him. "You mean I really get to stay forever?" "Forever," Charles said. "No more running." Victor stepped forward next, shaking Charles's hand without a word, then pulling him into a brief, firm hug. Charles returned it. "I saw Jacob smile today," Victor whispered. "First time in almost 2 years." Charles gripped his shoulder. "It's just the beginning." That evening, back at the house, Charles and Isaiah sat on the front steps beneath the porch light. The air was soft, scented with jasmine, and the faint smoke of someone grilling a few houses down. Fireflies blinked lazily along the hedges. Isaiah had his treasure box open between them. Inside were all the pieces of his story. The newspaper clipping, the photo with his mom, the pebble from the park, a dried wildflower someone had tucked behind his ear at the ceremony. And now, the adoption certificate. Charles watched him silently for a long time before speaking. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't said anything that day?" Isaiah nodded. "Sometimes. What do you think?" The boy looked up at him. "I think you'd be gone, and I'd still be sleeping behind trash bins, and maybe I wouldn't have talked to anyone again." Charles's throat tightened. "You gave me more than my life, Isaiah." Isaiah reached into the box and pulled out the yellow hat. "This is the only thing I had for a long time. When I didn't feel like a real person, I'd pull it over my eyes and pretend I was someone who mattered." He held it out. "Can you keep it now?" Charles blinked, caught off guard. "Are you sure?" "I don't need it anymore," Isaiah said, "because now I know I matter." Charles took the hat like it was made of gold, pressing it gently to his chest. "You always did." They sat in silence for a long time after that, watching the night settle in, not with fear, but with a kind of stillness that neither had known before. From the edge of the lawn, motion sensor lights flicked on. A delivery truck rolled down the street. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang not for a funeral, not for a ceremony, but for the simple passing of time. And in that quiet, beneath stars that didn't care where you were from, Charles Whitman and his son finally exhaled, safe, whole, and home.